What Was It? By Fitz James O'Brien. It is, I confess with considerable diffidence, that I approach the strange narrative which I am about to relate. The events which I purpose detailing are of so extraordinary a character that I am quite prepared to meet with an unusual amount of incredulity and scorn. I accept all such beforehand. I have, I trust, the literary courage to face unbelief. I have, after mature consideration, resolved to narrate in as simple and straightforward a manner as I can compass some facts that passed under my observation in the month of July last, and which, in the annals of the mysteries of physical science, are wholly unparalleled. I live at number 26th Street in Newark. The house is in some respects a curious one. It has enjoyed for the last 2 years the reputation of being haunted. It's a large and stately residence surrounded by what was once a garden, but which is now only a green enclosure used for bleaching clothes. The dry basin of what has been a fountain and a few fruit trees, ragged and unpruned, indicated that this spot in past days was a pleasant, shady retreat filled with fruits and flowers and the sweet murmur of waters. The house is very spacious. A hall of noble size leads to a large spiral staircase winding through its center, while the various apartments are of imposing dimensions. It was built some 15 or 20 years since by Mr. A, the well-known Newark merchant, who 5 years ago threw the commercial world into convulsions by a stupendous bank fraud. Mr. A, as everyone knows, escaped to Europe and died not long after of a broken heart. Almost immediately after the news of his decease reached this country and was verified, the report spread in 26th Street that number dash was haunted. Legal measures had disposed the widow of its former owner, and it was inhabited merely by a caretaker and his wife, placed there by the house agent into whose hands it had passed for the purpose of renting or sale. These people declared that they were troubled with unnatural noises. Doors were opened without any visible agency. Remnants of furniture scattered through the various rooms were, during the night, piled one upon the other by unknown hands. Invisible feet passed up and down the stairs in broad daylight, accompanied by the rustle of unseen silk dresses and gliding of viewless hands along the massive balusters. The caretaker and his wife declared they would live there no longer. The house agent laughed, dismissed them, and put others in their place. The noises and supernatural manifestations continued. The neighborhood caught up the story, and the house remained untenanted for 3 years. Several persons negotiated for it, but somehow, always before the bargain was closed, they heard the unpleasant rumors and declined to treat any further. It was in this state of things that my landlady, who at that time kept a boarding house in Bleecker Street and who wished to move further uptown, conceived the bold idea of renting number 26th Street. Happening to have in a house rather a plucky and philosophical set of boarders, she laid a scheme before us, stating candidly everything she had heard respecting the ghostly qualities of the establishment to which she wished to remove us. With the exception of 2 timid persons, a sea captain and a returned Californian, who immediately gave notice that they would leave, all of Mrs. Moffat's guests declared that they would accompany her in a chivalric incursion into the abode of spirits. Our removal was effected in the month of May, and we were charmed with our new residence. The portion of 26th Street where our house is situated, between 7th and 8th Avenues, is one of the pleasantest localities in Newark. The gardens back of the houses, running down nearly to the Hudson, form in the summertime a perfect avenue of verdure. The air is pure and invigorating, sweeping straight across the river from the Weehawken Heights, and even the ragged garden which surrounded the house, although displaying on washing days rather too much clothesline, still gave us a piece of greensward to look at and a cool retreat in the summer evenings where we smoked our cigars in the dusk and watched the fireflies flashing their dark lanterns in the long grass. Of course, we had no sooner established ourselves at number dash than we began to expect ghosts. We absolutely awaited their advent with eagerness. Our dinner conversation was supernatural. One of the boarders, who had purchased Mrs. Crow's Night Side of Nature for his own private delectation, was regarded as a public enemy by the entire household for not having bought 20 copies. The man led a life of supreme wretchedness while he was reading this volume. A system of espionage was established, of which he was the victim. If he incautiously laid the book down for an instant and left the room, it was immediately seized and read aloud in secret places to a select few. I found myself a person of immense importance, it having leaked out that I was tolerably well versed in the history of supernaturalism, and had once written a story the foundation of which was a ghost. If a table or a wainscot panel happened to warp when we were assembled in the large drawing room, there was an instant silence, and everyone was prepared for an immediate clunking of chains and a spectral form. After a month of psychological excitement, it was with the utmost dissatisfaction that we were forced to acknowledge that nothing in the remotest degree approaching the supernatural had manifested itself. Once the black butler asseverated that his candle had been blown out by some invisible agency while he was undressing himself for the night, but as I had more than once discovered this coloured gentleman in a condition when one candle must have appeared to him like two, thought it possible that, by going a step further in his potations, he might have reversed this phenomena and seen no candle at all where he ought to have beheld one. Things were in this state when an accident took place, so awful and inexplicable in its character that my reason fairly reels at the bare memory of the occurrence. It was the 10th of July. After dinner was over, I repaired with my friend Dr. Hammond to the garden to smoke my evening pipe. Independent of certain mental sympathies which existed between the doctor and myself, we were linked together by a vice. We both smoked opium. We knew each other's secret and respected it. We enjoyed together that wonderful expansion of thought, that marvelous intensifying of perceptive faculties, that boundless feeling of existence when we seemed to have points of contact with the whole universe. In short, that unimaginable spiritual bliss which I would not surrender for a throne, and which I hope you, reader, will never taste. Those hours of opium happiness which the doctor and I spent together in secret were regulated with a scientific accuracy. We did not blindly smoke the drug of paradise and leave our dreams to chance. While smoking, we carefully steered a conversation through the brightest and calmest channels of thought. We talked of the East and endeavored to recall the magical panorama of its glowing scenery. We criticized the most sensuous poets, those who painted life ruddy with health, brimming with passion, happy in the possession of youth and strength and beauty. If we talked of Shakespeare's Tempest, we lingered over Ariel and avoided Caliban. Like the Grubers, we turned our faces to the east and saw only the sunny side of the world. This skillful colouring of our train of thought produced in our subsequent visions a corresponding tone. The splendours of Arabian fairyland dyed our dreams. We paced the narrow strip of grass with the tread and port of kings. The song of the Rana Arborea, while he clung to the bark of the ragged plum tree, sounded like the strains of divine musicians. Houses, walls and streets melted like rain clouds, and vistas of unimaginable glory stretched away before us. It was a rapturous companionship. We enjoyed the vast delight more perfectly because even in our most ecstatic moments we were conscious of each other's presence. Our pleasures, while individual, were still twin, vibrating and moving in musical accord. On the evening in question, the 10th of July, the doctor and myself drifted into an unusually metaphysical mood. We lit our large meerschaums, filled with fine Turkish tobacco, in the core of which burned a little black nut of opium that, like the nut in the fairy tale, held within its narrow limits wonders beyond the reach of kings. We paced to and fro, conversing. A strange perversity dominated the currents of a thought. They would not flow through the sunlit channels into which we strove to divert them. For some unaccountable reason, they constantly diverged into dark and lonesome beds where a continual gloom brooded. It was in vain that after our old fashion we flung ourselves on the shores of the East and talked of its gay bazaars, of the splendours of the time of Haron, of harems and golden palaces. Black afrits continually arose from the depths of our talk and expanded like the one the fisherman released from the copper vessel until they blotted everything bright from our vision. Insensibly we yielded to the occult force that swayed us and indulged in gloomy speculation. We had talked some time upon the proneness of the human mind to mysticism and the almost universal love of the terrible when Hammond suddenly asked me, "What do you consider to be the greatest element of terror?" The question puzzled me. That many things were terrible, I knew. Stumbling over a corpse in the dock, beholding, as I once did, a woman floating down a deep and rapid river with wildly lifted arms and awful upturned face, uttering, as she drifted, shrieks that rent one's heart, while we spectators stood frozen at a window which overhung the river at a height of 60 feet, unable to make the slightest effort to save her, but dumbly watching a last supreme agony and her disappearance. A shattered wreck, with no life visible, encountered floating listlessly on the ocean, is a terrible object, for it suggests a huge terror, the proportions of which are veiled. But it now struck me for the first time that there must be one great and ruling embodiment of fear, a king of terrors to which all others must succumb. What might it be? To what train of circumstances would it owe its existence? "I confess, Hammond," I replied to my friend, "I never considered this subject before. That there must be one something more terrible than any other thing, I feel. I cannot attempt, however, even the most vague definition." "I am somewhat like you, Harry," he answered. "I feel my capacity to experience a terror greater than anything yet conceived by the human mind, something combining in fearful and unnatural amalgamation hitherto supposed incompatible elements. The calling of the voices in Brockton Bourne's novel of Wieland is awful. So is the picture of the dweller of the threshold in Bulwer's Zanoni. But," he added, shaking his head gloomily, "there is something more horrible still than those." "Look here, Hammond," I rejoined, "let us drop this kind of talk for heaven's sake. We shall suffer for it. Depend on it." "I don't know what's the matter with me tonight," he replied, "but my brain is running upon all sorts of weird and awful thoughts. I feel as if I could write a story like Hoffman tonight if I were only master of a literary style. Well, if we are going to be Hoffmanesque in our talk, I'm off to bed. Opium and nightmare should never be brought together. How sultry it is. Good night, Hammond. Good night, Harry. Pleasant dreams to you. To you, gloomy wretch, afrits, ghouls, and enchanters." We parted, and each sought his respective chamber. I undressed quickly and got into bed, taking with me, according to my usual custom, a book over which I generally read myself to sleep. I opened the volume as soon as I had laid my head upon the pillow, and instantly flung it to the other side of the room. It was Gauden's History of Monsters, a curious French work which I had lately imported from Paris, but which, in the state of mind I had then reached, was anything but an agreeable companion. I resolved to go to sleep at once, so turning down my gas until nothing but a little blue point of light glimmered on the top of the tube, I composed myself to rest. The room was in total darkness. The atom of gas that still remained alight did not illuminate a distance of 3 inches round the burner. I desperately drew my arm across my eyes as if to shut out even the darkness and tried to think of nothing. It was in vain. The confounded themes touched on by Hammond in the garden kept obtruding themselves on my brain. I battled against them. I erected ramparts of would-be blackness of intellect to keep them out. They still crowded upon me. While I was lying still as a corpse, hoping that by a perfect physical inaction I should hasten mental repose, an awful incident occurred. As something dropped, as it seemed, from the ceiling, plumb upon my chest, and the next instant I felt 2 bony hands encircling my throat, endeavoring to choke me. I am no coward, and am possessed of considerable physical strength. The suddenness of the attack, instead of stunning me, strung every nerve to its highest tension. My body acted from instinct before my brain had time to realize the terrors of my position. In an instant, I wound 2 muscular arms around the creature and squeezed it with all the strength of despair against my chest. In a few seconds, the bony hands that had fastened on my throat loosened their hold, and I was free to breathe once more. Then commenced a struggle of awful intensity. Immersed in the most profound darkness, totally ignorant of the nature of the thing by which I was so suddenly attacked, finding my grasp slipping every moment, by reason, it seemed to me, of the entire nakedness of my assailant, bitten with sharp teeth from the shoulder, neck, and chest, having every moment to protect my throat against a pair of sinewy, agile hands which my utmost efforts could not confine, These were a combination of circumstances to combat which required all the strength, skill, and courage that I had possessed. At last, after a silent, deadly, exhausting struggle, I got my assailant under by a series of incredible efforts of strength. Once pinned, with my knees on what I made to be its chest, I knew that I was victor. I rested for a moment to breathe. I heard the creature beneath me panting in the darkness and felt the violent throbbing of a heart. It was apparently as exhausted as I was. That was one comfort. At this moment, I remembered that I usually placed under my pillow before going to bed a large yellow silk pocket handkerchief. I felt for it instantly. It was there. In a few seconds more, I had, after a fashion, pinioned the creature's arms. I now felt tolerably secure. There was nothing more to be done but to turn on the gas, and having first seen what my midnight assailant was like, arouse the household. I will confess to being actuated by a certain pride in not giving the alarm before. I wished to make the capture alone and unaided. Never losing my hold for an instant, I slipped from the bed to the floor, dragging my captive with me. I had but few steps to make to reach the gas burner. These I made with greatest caution, holding the creature in a grip like a vice. At last I got within arm's length of the tiny speck of blue light which told me where the gas burner lay. Quick as lightning, I released my grasp with one hand and let on the full flood of light. Then I turned to look at my captor. I cannot even attempt to give any definition of my sensations the instant after I turned on the gas. I suppose I must have shrieked with terror, for in less than a minute afterward, my room was crowded with the inmates of the house. I shudder now as I think of that awful moment. I saw nothing. Yes, I had one arm firmly clasped around a breathing, panting, corporeal shape, my other hand gripped with all its strength a throat as warm, as apparently fleshy as my own, and yet, with this living substance in my grasp, with its body pressed against my own, and all in the bright glare of a large jet of gas, I absolutely beheld nothing, not even an outline, a vapor. I do not, even at this hour, realize the situation in which I found myself. I cannot recall the astounding incident thoroughly. Imagination in vain tries to compass the awful paradox. It breathed. I felt its warm breath upon my cheek. It struggled fiercely. It had hands. They clutched me. Its skin was smooth like my own. There it lay, pressed close up against me, solid as stone, and yet utterly invisible. I wonder that I did not faint or go mad on the instant. Some wonderful instinct must have sustained me, for absolutely, in place of loosening my hold on the terrible enigma, I seemed to gain an additional strength in my moment of horror and tightened my grasp with such wonderful force that I felt the creature shivering with agony. Just then, Hammond entered my room at the head of the household. As soon as he beheld my face, which I suppose must have been an awful sight to look at, he hastened forward, crying, "Great heaven, Harry! What has happened?" "Hammond! Hammond!" I cried. "Come here." "Oh, this is awful. I've been attacked in bed by something or other which I have hold of. But I can't see it. I can't see it." Hammond, doubtless struck by the unfeigned horror expressed in my countenance, made one or two steps forward with an anxious yet puzzled expression. A very audible titter burst from the remainder of my visitors. This suppressed laughter made me furious. To laugh at a human being in my position, it was a worse species of cruelty. Now I can understand why the appearance of a man struggling violently, as it would seem, with an airy nothing and calling for assistance against a vision should have appeared ludicrous. Then, so great was my rage against the mocking crowd that had I the power, I would have stricken them dead where they stood. "Hammond! Hammond!" I cried again, despairingly. "For God's sake, come to me. I can hold the thing but a short while longer. It's overpowering me. Help me! Help me!" "Harry," whispered Hammond, approaching me, "you have been smoking too much opium." "I swear to you, Hammond, that this is no vision," I answered in the same low tone. "Don't you see how it shakes my whole frame with its struggles? If you don't believe me, convince yourself. Feel it. Touch it." Hammond advanced and laid his hand in the spot I indicated. A wild cry of horror burst from him. He had felt it. In a moment, he had discovered somewhere in my room a long piece of cord and was the next instant winding it and knotting it about the body of the unseen being that I clasped in my arms. "Harry," he said in a hoarse, agitated voice, for, though he preserved his presence of mind, he was deeply moved. "Harry, it's all safe now. You may let go, old fellow, if you're tired. The thing can't move." I was utterly exhausted, and I gladly loosed my hold. Hammond stood holding the ends of the cord that bound the invisible, twisted round his hand, while before him, self-supporting as it were, it beheld a rope laced when interlaced and stretching tightly around a vacant space. I never saw a man look so thoroughly stricken with awe. Nevertheless, his face expressed all the courage and determination which I knew him to possess. His lips, although white, were set firmly, and one could perceive at a glance that although stricken with fear, he was not daunted. The confusion that ensued among the guests of the house, who were witnesses of this extraordinary scene between Hammond and myself, who beheld the pantomime of binding the struggling something, who beheld me almost sinking from a physical exhaustion when my task of jailer was over, the confusion and terror that took possession of the bystanders when they saw all this was beyond description. The weaker ones fled from the apartment. The few who remained clustered near the door and could not be induced to approach Hammond and his charge. Still incredulity broke out through their terror. They had not the courage to satisfy themselves, and yet they doubted. It was in vain that I begged some of the men to come near and convince themselves by touch of the existence in that room of a living being which was invisible. They were incredulous, but did not dare to undeceive themselves. "How could a solid, living, breathing body be invisible?" they asked. My reply was this. I gave a sign to Hammond, and both of us, conquering a fearful repugnance to touch the invisible creature, lifted it from the ground, manacled as it was, and took it to my bed. Its weight was about that of a boy of 14. "Now, my friends," I said, as Hammond and myself held the creature suspended over the bed, "I can give you self-evident proof that there is a solid, ponderable body which nevertheless you cannot see. Be good enough to watch the surface of the bed attentively." I was astonished at my own courage in treating this strange event so calmly, but I had recovered from my first terror and felt a sort of scientific pride in the affair which dominated every other feeling. The eyes of the bystanders were immediately fixed on my bed. At a given signal, Hammond and I let the creature fall. There was a dull sound of a heavy body alighting on a soft mass. The timbers of the bed creaked. A deep impression marked itself distinctly on the pillow and on the bed itself. The crowd who witnessed this gave a low cry and rushed from the room. Hammond and I were left alone with a mystery. We remained silent for some time, listening to the low, irregular breathing of the creature on the bed and watching the rustle of the bedclothes as it impotently struggled to free itself from confinement. Then Hammond spoke. "Harry, this is awful. Aye, awful, but not unaccountable." "Not unaccountable? What do you mean? Such a thing has never occurred since the birth of the world." "I know not what to think, Hammond. God grant that I am not mad, and that this is not an insane fantasy. Let us reason a little, Harry. Here is a solid body which we touch, but which we cannot see. The fact is so unusual that it strikes us with terror. Is there no parallel, though, for such a phenomena? Take a piece of pure glass. It is tangible and transparent. A certain chemical coarseness is all that prevents its being so entirely transparent as to be totally invisible. It is not theoretically impossible, mind you, to make a glass which shall not reflect a single ray of light, a glass so pure and homogeneous in its atoms that the rays from the sun will pass through it as they do through the air, refracted but not reflected. We do not see the air, and yet we feel it. That's all very well, Hammond, but these are inanimate substances. Glass does not breathe. Air does not breathe. This thing has a heart that palpitates, a will that moves it, lungs that play and inspire and respire. You forget the phenomena of which we have so often heard of late, answered the doctor gravely. At the meetings called spirit circles, invisible hands have been thrust into the hands of those persons round the table, warm, fleshy hands that seem to pulsate with mortal life. What? Do you think then that this thing is— I don't know what it is, was his solemn reply. But please the gods, I will, with your assistance, thoroughly investigate it. We watched together, smoking many pipes all night long, by the bedside of the unearthly being that tossed and panted until it was apparently wearied out. Then we learned by the low, regular breathing that it slept. The next morning, the house was all astir. The boarders congregated on the landing outside my room, and Hammond and myself were lions. We had to answer 1,000 questions as to the state of our extraordinary prisoner, for as yet not one person in the house except ourselves could be induced to set foot in the apartment. The creature was awake. This was evidenced by the convulsive manner in which the bedclothes were moved in its efforts to escape. There was something truly terrible in beholding, as it were, those second-hand indications of the terrible writhings and agonized struggles for liberty which themselves were invisible. Hammond and myself had racked our brains during the long night to discover some means by which we might realize the shape and general appearance of the enigma, as well as we could make out by passing our hands over the creature's form. Its outlines and lineaments were human. There was a mouth, a round, smooth head without hair, a nose which, however, was little elevated above the cheeks, and its hands and feet felt like those of a boy. At first we thought of placing the being on a smooth surface and tracing its outlines with chalk, as shoemakers trace the outline of the foot. This plan was given up as being of no value. Such an outline would give not the slightest idea of its conformation. A happy thought struck me. We would take a cast of it in plaster of Paris. This would give us the solid figure and satisfy all our wishes. But how to do it? The movements of the creature would disturb the setting of the plastic covering and distort the mold. Another thought. Why not give it chloroform? It had respiratory organs, that was evident by its breathing. Once reduced to a state of insensibility, we could do with it what we would. Dr. X was sent for, and after the worthy physician had recovered from the first shock of amazement, he proceeded to administer the chloroform. In 3 minutes afterward, we were enabled to remove the fetters from the creature's body, and a modeler was busily engaged in covering the invisible form with moist clay. In 5 minutes more, we had a mold, and before evening, a rough facsimile of the mystery. It was shaped like a man, distorted, uncouth, and horrible, but still a man. It was small, not over 4 feet and some inches in height, and its limbs revealed a muscular development that was unparalleled. Its face surpassed in hideousness anything I had ever seen. Gustave Doré, a Callot, or Tony Johannot never conceived anything so horrible. There is a phase in one of the latter's illustrations to Un Voyage Où Voit Plaira, which somewhat approaches the countenance of this creature, but does not equal it. It was the physiognomy of what I should fancy a ghoul might be. It looked as if it was capable of feeding on human flesh. Having satisfied our curiosity and bound everyone in the house to secrecy, it became a question of what has to be done with our enigma. It was impossible that we should keep such a horror in our house. It was equally impossible that such an awful being should be let loose upon the world. I confess that I would have gladly voted for the creature's destruction. But who would shoulder the responsibility? Who would undertake the execution of this horrible semblance of a human being? Day after day, this question was deliberated bravely. The boarders all left the house. Mrs. Moffat was in despair, and threatened Hammond and myself with all sorts of legal penalties if we did not remove the horror. Our answer was, "We will go if you like, but we decline taking this creature with us. Remove it yourself, if you please. It appeared in your house. On you the responsibility rests." To this there was, of course, no answer. Mrs. Moffat could not obtain for love or money a person who would even approach the mystery. The most singular part of the affair was that we were entirely ignorant of what the creature habitually fed on. Everything in the way of nutriment that we could think of was placed before it, but was never touched. It was awful to stand by day after day and see the cloths toss and hear the hard breathing and know that it was starving. 10, 12 days, a fortnight passed, and it still lived. The pulsations of the heart, however, were daily growing fainter and had now nearly ceased. It was evident that the creature was dying for want of sustenance. While this terrible life struggle was going on, I felt miserable. I could not sleep. Horrible as the creature was, it was painful to think of the pangs it was suffering. At last, it died. Hammond and I found it cold and stiff one morning in the bed. The heart had ceased to beat, the lungs to inspire. We hastened to bury it in the garden. It was a strange funeral, the dropping of that viewless corpse into the damp hole. The cast of its form I gave to Dr. X. who keeps it in his museum in 10th Street. As I am on the eve of a long journey from which I may not return, I have drawn up this narrative of an event the most singular that has ever come to my knowledge.
Was It a Dream? By Guy de Maupassant. I had loved her madly. Why does one love? Why does one love? How queer it is to see only one being in the world, to have only one thought in one's mind, only one desire in the heart, and only one name on the lips. A name which comes up continually, rising like the water in a spring, from the depths of the soul to the lips. A name which one repeats over and over again, which one whispers ceaselessly, everywhere, like a prayer. I am going to tell you our story, for love only has one, which is always the same. I met her and loved her. That is all. And for a whole year I have lived on her tenderness, on her caresses, in her arms, in her dresses, on her words, so completely wrapped up, bound and absorbed in everything which came from her, that I no longer cared whether it was day or night, or whether I was dead or alive on this old earth of ours. And then she died. How? I do not know. I no longer know anything. But one evening she came home wet, for it was raining heavily. And the next day she coughed, and she coughed for about a week and took to her bed. What happened I do not remember now, but doctors came, wrote, and went away. Medicines were brought, and some women made her drink them. Her hands were hot, her forehead was burning, and her eyes bright and sad. When I spoke to her, she answered me, but I do not remember what we said. I have forgotten everything, everything, everything. She died, and I very well remember her slight, feeble sigh. The nurse said, "Ah," and I understood. I understood. I knew nothing more. I saw a priest who said, "Your mistress?" And it seemed to me as if he were insulting her. As she was dead, nobody had the right to say that any longer, and I turned him out. Another came who was very kind and tender, and I shed tears when he spoke to me about her. They consulted me about the funeral, but I do not remember anything that they said, though I recollected the coffin and the sound of the hammer when they nailed her down in it. Oh, God! God! She was buried. She, in that hole. Some people came, female friends. I made my escape and ran away. I ran, and then walked through the streets, went home, and the next day started on a journey. Yesterday, I returned to Paris, and when I saw my room again, our room, our bed, our furniture, everything that remains of the life of a human being after death, I was seized by such a violent attack of fresh grief that I felt like opening the window and throwing myself out into the street. I could not remain any longer among these things, between these walls which had enclosed and sheltered her, which retained 1,000 atoms of her skin, and of her breath in their imperceptible crevices. I took up my hat to make my escape, and just as I reached the door, I passed the large glass in the hall, which she had put there so that she might look at herself every day from head to foot as she went out, to see if her toilette looked well, and was correct and pretty, from her little boots to her bonnet. I stopped short in front of that looking-glass in which she had so often been reflected. So often, that it must have retained her reflection. I was standing there, trembling, with my eyes fixed on the glass, on that flat, profound, empty glass, which had contained her entirely, and had possessed her as much as my passionate looks had. I felt as if I loved that glass. I touched it. It was cold. Oh, the recollection. Sorrowful mirror, burning mirror, horrible mirror, to make men suffer such torments. Happy is the man whose heart forgets everything that it has contained, everything that has passed before it, everything that has looked at itself in it, or has been reflected in its affection, in its love. How I suffer! I went out without knowing it, without wishing it, and towards the cemetery. I found her simple grave, a white marble cross, with these few words: "She loved, was loved, and died." She is there below, decayed. How horrible! I sobbed with my forehead on the ground, and I stopped there for a long time, a long time. Then I saw that it was getting dark, and a strange, mad wish, the wish of a despairing lover, seized me. I wished to pass the night, the last night, in weeping on her grave. But I should be seen and driven out. How was I to manage? I was cunning, and got up and began to roam about in that city of the dead. I walked and walked. How small this city is in comparison with the other, the city in which we live. And yet, how much more numerous the dead are than the living. We want high houses, wide streets, and much room for the 4 generations who see the daylight at the same time, drink water from the spring, and wine from the vines, and eat bread from the plains. And for all the generations of the dead, for all that ladder of humanity that has descended down to us, there is scarcely anything. The earth takes them back, and oblivion effaces them. Adieu. At the end of the cemetery, I suddenly perceived that I was in its oldest part, where those who had been dead a long time are mingling with the soil, where the crosses themselves are decayed, where possibly newcomers will be put tomorrow. It is full of untended roses, of strong and dark cypress trees, a sad and beautiful garden, nourished on human flesh. I was alone, perfectly alone. So I crouched in a green tree and hid myself there completely amid the thick and somber branches. I waited, clinging to the stem like a shipwrecked man does to a plank. When it was quite dark, I left my refuge and began to walk softly, slowly, inaudibly through that ground full of dead people. I wandered about for a long time, but could not find her tomb again. I went on with extended arms, knocking against the tombs with my hands, my feet, my knees, my chest, even with my head, without being able to find her. I groped about like a blind man finding his way. I felt the stones, the crosses, the iron railings, the metal wreaths, and the wreaths of faded flowers. I read the names with my fingers by passing them over the letters. What a night! What a night! I could not find her again. There was no moon. What a night! I was frightened, horribly frightened in these narrow paths between 2 rows of graves. Graves, graves, graves! Nothing but graves! On my right, on my left, in front of me, around me, everywhere there were graves! I sat down on one of them, for I could not walk any longer. My knees were so weak. I could hear my heart beat. And I heard something else as well. What? A confused, nameless noise. Was the noise in my head, in the impenetrable night, or beneath the mysterious earth, the earth sown with human corpses? I looked all around me, but I cannot say how long I remained there. I was paralyzed with terror, cold with fright, ready to shout out, ready to die. Suddenly, it seemed to me that the slab of marble on which I was sitting was moving. Certainly it was moving, as if it were being raised. With a bound, I sprang onto the neighboring tomb, and I saw, yes, I distinctly saw the stone which I had just quitted rise upright. Then the dead person appeared, a naked skeleton, pushing the stone back with its bent back. I saw it quite clearly, although the night was so dark. On the cross I could read, "Here lies Jacques Olivant, who died at the age of 51. He loved his family, was kind and honorable, and died in the grace of the Lord." The dead man also read what was inscribed on his tombstone. Then he picked up a stone off the path, a little pointed stone, and began to scrape the letters carefully. He slowly effaced them, and with the hollows of his eyes he looked at the places where they had been engraved. Then, with the tip of the bone that had been his forefinger, he wrote in luminous letters, like those lines which boys trace on walls with the tip of a lucifer match, "Here reposes Jacques Olivant, who died at the age of 51. He hastened his father's death by his unkindness, as he wished to inherit his fortune. He tortured his wife, tormented his children, deceived his neighbors, robbed everyone he could, and died wretched." When he had finished writing, the dead man stood motionless, looking at his work. On turning round, I saw that all the graves were open, that all the dead bodies had emerged from them, and that all had effaced the lies inscribed on the gravestones by their relations, substituting the truth instead. And I saw that all had been the tormentors of their neighbors, malicious, dishonest, hypocrites, liars, rogues, calumniators, envious, that they had stolen, deceived, performed every disgraceful, every abominable action. These good fathers, these faithful wives, these devoted sons, these chaste daughters, these honest tradesmen, these men and women who were called irreproachable. They were all writing at the same time, on the threshold of their eternal abode, the truth, the terrible and holy truth of which everybody was ignorant, or pretended to be ignorant, while they were alive. I thought that she also must have written something on her tombstone, and now, running without any fear among the half-opened coffins, among the corpses and skeletons, I went toward her, sure that I should find her immediately. I recognized her at once, without seeing her face, which was covered by the winding sheet, and on the marble cross where shortly before I had read, "She loved, was loved, and died," I now saw, having gone out in the rain one day in order to deceive her lover, she caught cold and died. It appears that they found me at daybreak, lying on the grave, unconscious.
An Eye for an Eye by G.W. Crane. "But Mother is too sick to be moved," the girl said imploringly. She was rather slim and a trifle taller than average. Her face was beautiful, in spite of the paleness of her cheeks and the slightly dark circles beneath her eyes. She taught the first-grade pupils of the little community, and they literally worshipped her. "If you can give me only a little more time, I am sure that I can get the money," she continued, and then waited anxiously for the wizen-faced man to reply. "No, sir," the latter answered roughly, as he rubbed his hands together and frowned upon the girl. "Business is business. I've been waiting for that house of yours for several years, and now I'm going to have it. Unless," he smiled grimly, "you bring in the money and pay off the mortgage by tomorrow morning." "But please, Mr. Seaman, I have no money. My mother's illness has taken everything I had, and more, too. But if you will wait just a little longer—" "That will do, that will do," the old man spoke in a rasping voice. "I've been too good to you already. And then, there's that little shack at the other edge of the village. You can move into that. It won't hurt you." "But I tell you that Mother is too ill to be moved," the girl spoke desperately. The shriveled old man waved his hand in a gesture of dismissal. "Haven't you any sympathy at all?" the young woman asked in one last appeal. "Sympathy? Bosh! That's all foolishness. It leads to bankruptcy. That's what I always used to tell your father before he died. But no, he would not see it that way." The old man spoke with infinite sarcasm. "Now, don't you disturb me any longer. There's the door." And he waved a claw-like hand in its direction. The girl stood irresolutely a moment, while her face alternately flushed and then grew pale. She felt once as if she could murder the heartless old skinflint as he sat at his desk. There was no way to get the money, and she perceived that she was absolutely in the hands of this merciless creature. With rage and despair consuming her spirit, she left the room. The next day, the girl and her invalid mother were forced to leave their cozy little home and move into the damp, decaying house at the other end of the village. Neighbors insisted that the sick woman could come into their homes, but even in her illness, the invalid was too proud to do so. 2 weeks later, the suffering of the poor old woman was at an end. Out in the cemetery, a haggard girl watched the lumpy, half-frozen clods of earth fall down upon the casket and shut in forever the body of her loved one. She did not leave with most of her neighbors who had attended the funeral, but stood silent, watching the swiftly filling hole. Her eyes were dry. There were no tears left to soothe her. She had wept at the words of the minister, but now she had ceased. A fierce bitterness filled her heart. When the mound had been finished, the pastor gently touched her arm, intending to lead her back to the carriage. But the girl fiercely stood off the friendly hand. "Leave me alone," she said. "But it is damp and cold, and I want you to ride back home. All the other vehicles have gone." "I can walk," she answered shortly. The minister regarded her a moment, and then decided that it might be best to let her remain. He began to retrace his steps toward his conveyance. Reaching a bend in the road, he looked back, but the solitary figure was still standing, motionless. By most of the villagers, Mr. Seaman was considered to be the stingiest, most tight-fisted old skinflint that ever lived. The older he became, the more his mercilessness seemed to increase. Even the dogs, when they saw him coming down the street, got out of his way. The old man lived in a small, ramshackle cottage at the edge of the village, and no one ever visited him there. He had a little office above the local bank, and it was in this that his callers found him when they wished to adjust money matters. For several weeks, the old man had been feeling a peculiar numbness all along his right side. At first, he paid scarcely any heed to it, but it did not go away. As a result, he began to pinch his right leg every morning to see whether he was any better. He could notice no improvement, and, as time passed, he believed that he was getting worse. "I suppose it's just because I'm getting older than I used to be," he thought, but this did not comfort him at all. As a consequence, he determined to consult the town's physician, and although he regretted wasting his money in this manner, he went up to see Dr. Jackson. The physician told him that it acted very much like paralysis, and that a complete numbness of his whole body might result. Although this might be gradual, he said, it might occur at a sudden stroke. The doctor did not try especially to allay the old man's fears, for he shared the popular feeling toward the miser, and he saw that he was very susceptible to suggestion. Sherman came away very much frightened. He did not appear to fear death itself, strange as this would seem. Perhaps it would never occur to him that his paralysis might be fatal. What really terrified him, however, was the idea that he might be rendered incapable of making either movement or sound, and that then he would be buried alive. This thought of being locked up in a coffin while he was not actually dead haunted him day and night. In his sleep, he would dream of being locked within a casket, unable to utter a word, yet comprehending all that went on around him. He could hear the dirt fall shovelful after shovelful upon the box in which he was imprisoned. He could feel the air becoming oppressive. Then he would swing his arms sideways, only to find himself shut in. He would kick and endeavor to lift the lid, but 6 feet of damp earth would be crushing it down against his feeble efforts. He would beat frantically upon the encircling boards, but the hard-packed earth would muffle the sound. He could feel the pitch blackness of his stifling tomb. He could not see. He had used up almost all the air within his narrow coffin. He could imagine the gravediggers walking around complacent, several feet above him. If he could only make them hear. He was smothering, buried alive. With a scream of horror, he would awaken and lay panting as he tried to recover from his nightmare. But he could not entirely push these dreams away, for he knew that there might be some truth in them. He had already seen an article in a magazine telling of such a case. He decided that he must find the article again. Searching for several hours through the pile of magazines which he kept stacked within one of his small rooms, he at length came upon the story which he had been seeking. Although it frightened him, he could not help reading it again. He learned that, for some reason, the buried man had been dug up a few weeks after his interment, and when the casket had been opened, the dead man was found lying on his stomach, with one hand clutching his scalp, from which most of the hair had been torn off. Fascinated by the horror of the tale, he found himself reading it again. He could not help himself. For the remainder of the night, he would be thinking of the possibility that he himself might be buried alive. In the daytime, he was obsessed with this same thought, even while he walked down the street to his office, and he found it more difficult to do so every day. He could clearly imagine himself so paralyzed that the neighbors might take him to be dead. Mentally, he could see them gathering around his bedside. He could feel them lift him into the casket. He could feel himself driven to the cemetery and lowered into the cold ground, all the while powerless to cry out or show in any way that he still lived. This idea almost smothered him, even while he was wide awake. He grew haggard because of his fear and would go about the town muttering to himself and occasionally flinging out his arms, as if to push off something that seemed to be enveloping him. People thought that he was going crazy, and indeed his actions tended further to substantiate their judgment, for he grew more queer from day to day. At last, he went back to see Dr. Jackson and confided his fear in him. The latter only laughed and told him not to worry, for the townspeople would not bury him before he was entirely dead. Anyway, the doctor added, the embalming fluid will kill you if you aren't dead already. No, 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 screamed the terrified old man. I won't be embalmed! I won't be embalmed! And his voice rose more shrilly at each repetition. Promise me you won't let them embalm me, he demanded. His eyes shone wildly. The doctor began to place credence in the report of the town's gossips concerning the old man's madness. But everyone's embalmed nowadays, he explained. But I don't want to be, the miser said fiercely as he began to shudder. I might not be dead for sure, and if I am not embalmed, then I could come to life again. The doctor finally promised that he would not permit the poisonous chemicals to be placed within the old man's veins, in case the latter should die. Now there is something else I want you to promise me, the miser went on. I have been dreaming that I shall be buried alive. Oh, but I live, he added as the doctor began to shake his head. If I were buried in the usual manner and should wake up... Here he trembled, and a look of horror spread over his face. But I won't be buried that way, he yelled in a frenzy. Promise me that you will do as I say, he exclaimed in a tone that expressed the mixture of both command and entreaty. Well, what is it? The doctor asked curiously. I'm going to have a bell placed near my grave with a rope leading down into my coffin, and then, if I revive, I shall pull the cord and ring the bell. But who would hear it? Dr. Jackson asked as he vainly strove to check a smile. Oh, there is a farmhouse not too far from the cemetery, and somebody there would hear it and come and dig me up. You'd smother before they could even get to you, the doctor objected. No, I have everything planned, and I have it written down so that you can do it just as I wish. I'll pay you now for your trouble. He handed the doctor a $50 bill. Promise me that you will do it, he pleaded. Dr. Jackson, thinking it all to be nonsense, nevertheless promised, and the miser slowly hobbled off. The doctor thought it all a good joke, and the news soon spread about the village. And to think, the doctor said to a group of men standing in front of the little drugstore, the old tightwad gave me this 50 to see that his fool notions were carried out. He showed them the bill. The old man was the object of a great many jokes during the ensuing weeks, but he himself was feeling much more at ease to think that the doctor had pledged himself to carry out his wishes. The miser's right leg, however, was growing more and more numb. Each morning he would pinch it to see if there were any feeling left. It became very difficult for him to walk, so he decided to supervise personally the erection of the bell. It was a large iron one, much like the ordinary farmhouse dinner bell, which the rural housewives use to notify the men in the field that dinner is ready. The old man had it fastened to a post, which was set in the ground near the spot which he had chosen for his grave. The time finally came when the shriveled figure of the miser did not appear on the street, and the investigation revealed him lying upon his bed, almost wholly paralyzed. Dr. Jackson obtained one of the middle-aged women in the village to wait upon him and give him his food, for he could not even move his arms to feed himself. For a few weeks more he lay in this helpless condition, gradually becoming more and more dependent upon his nurse. One morning he failed to open his eyes, and lay motionless, giving no sign of life whatever. Dr. Jackson had a great number of calls to make that day, and so it was not until late in the evening that he could attend the old fellow. Tired out from his labors, the doctor made a hasty examination, and said there was no doubt about his being dead. The next day, the doctor gave the miser's written instructions to his man-of-all-work, and told him to see that they were fulfilled. The latter had a hole bored in the lid of the coffin, through which the rope was passed. One end of it was placed in the hand of the corpse, and the remainder of the rope was pushed through a 1-inch pipe and fastened to the bell. The pipe permitted the rope to be pulled easily. Otherwise, the earth would have checked it. According to the miser's orders, another tube connected the cheap casket with the open air. This would permit him to breathe if he should not be entirely dead. The earth was rapidly shoveled into the opening, and in a short time a mound of yellow clay marked the old skinflint's last abode. It was unlike other newly made graves, however, for a rope reached out of it to a bell nearby, and 6 inches of an air pipe protruded. The gravediggers left the spot and returned to their homes. The cemetery was deserted unless one believes that the spirits of the dead hover above the last resting place of their bodies. About 3 o'clock next morning, the sleepy telephone operator in the little office above the drugstore received a call. "Hello, hello!" a frightened woman's voice exclaimed. "This is Harding's. Say, that bell over in the cemetery has been ringing for 10 minutes. It's getting louder and louder. Call the constable, or somebody, quick. There ain't any men folks at our place now, and we're scared to death." The operator was wide awake, for everybody knew the story of the burial of the old miser. She called the doctor, but could get no response. In desperation, she called the gravediggers, and 2 others, to go out to the ghostly spot. As soon as she had sent them on their weird quest, she called the Harding farmhouse. "That bell quit ringing several minutes ago," Mrs. Harding replied. "I don't know what to think." 4 men reached the dark cemetery with its eerie tombstones faintly visible all about them. Hurriedly, and with conflicting emotions, they ran to the new grave. What they saw startled them so that they almost turned back. The rope, which had been fastened to the bell, now was tied to the foot of the post. Even as they looked, they could make out a slight movement of the rope. It grew taut, and then they could see it slacken. "Gosh, he's come back to life," one of the men whispered hoarsely. "Look, look," his companion shouted, and pointed to the air pipe. How it got there they did not know, but a bucket was forced down over the end of the tube into the fresh earth, cutting off all the air supply from the coffin. One of the gravediggers kicked the bucket off, and then they all set to work digging. Frantically, yet fearfully, they threw out the fresh earth. Their lanterns cast weird shadows about them, and dimly lighted up the somber tombstones nearby. They scarcely said a word, but when they did, it was in a very low tone. Thud. A shovel had at last struck the wooden box. It startled the men. They were not any less courageous than the average, but their surroundings and the peculiar situation in which they found themselves would have affected the nerves of anybody. Quickly, they cleared off the top of the coffin. "Hello? Are you alive?" There was no answer. "I think Hardings imagined they heard the bell ring," one of the men muttered. "But didn't we see the rope move?" another objected. "Well, you can open the lid," the first speaker added. They held their 2 lanterns down inside the pit, which they had just made. The yellow flames flickered and sputtered. The bravest of the 4 men used his shovel for a lever and pried up the coffin top. Slowly, hesitatingly, he peered inside. An unexpected movement from within would have caused him instantly to drop the lid. He still could not make out the dead man's form. Carefully, he jerked the top clear back, and the 4 spectators were terrified. If they had been out of the pit in which they stood, it is doubtful whether they would have remained for a second glance. As it was, they were standing on the edge of the casket, and could not easily escape. The old man's form was turned over and hunched up, as if he had vainly striven to lift the tons of earth that had held him captive. His right arm was stretched out along the side of his prison, and the nails of his fingers were torn off. The sides of the casket were clawed and scratched, and the scalp of the dead man was frighteningly lacerated. All his hair had been pulled out by the roots, and a wad of it was still fiercely clasped in the miser's left hand. Even while they looked on, a great fear consumed them. "Ha ha ha ha!" Demoniacal laughter came to their ears. This was too much. Clawing and scrambling, they clambered over each other in trying to get out of the pit. "Ha ha 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 ha!" A shrill laughter continued from far up the hillside. It pursued the fleeing men. To their terrified minds, the fiendish sounds seemed to be taken up and re-echoed by each of the tombstones which they passed in their flight. "Ha ha ha ha! Ha 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 ha! Ha 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 ha!" The ghostly shrieks ran in their ears as they raced toward the village. Unexplained, the mystery continued to frighten the superstitious for 2 days after the miser had been reburied. Then a tragedy particularly turned their attention from this weird affair. The body of the girl whose mother had been turned out of their home was found floating in the river, not far from the little village. "Too bad," the doctor had said. "She must have lost her mind brooding over her mother's death." And this was the consensus of opinion. And no one ever thought to associate the gentle young schoolteacher with the fiendish laughter which had floated over the cemetery.